Welcome. I'm Lynette Kraft. I'm the Chief Science Officer of ACSM. We're really excited to continue our brown bag series in science today. We have some ACSM staff here at the National Center attending, as well as we have some students who are joining us remotely. Today, we're very excited to have Cheri Blauwet with us. Cheri did her undergraduate in molecular biology at the University of Arizona and then medical school at Stanford. She is currently a physician at Harvard's Brigham and Women's Hospital. And probably most importantly to today's conversation, she is a Paralympic athlete that has represented the US at, let's see, 2 different Paralympic Games, and she's won multiple medals as a track and field athlete, including a gold medal. She's also won the New York City Marathon several times, the Los Angeles Marathon several times, and the Boston Marathon several times. So quite an accomplished athlete. Now she helps continue to serve the International Paralympic Committee as the chair of the medical committee. And Cheri is also one of our presidential appointments to the ACSM Board of Trustees. So today Cheri is going to talk to us about some longitudinal research she's been involved with, looking at injury and illness in Paralympic athletes during the Games. So welcome, Cheri. We're thrilled to have you. And at this point, we'll turn it over to you. We're going to hold questions till the end. After Cheri's presentation, we'll get started.
Okay, thanks so very much, Lynette. And I very much appreciate the invitation. Please just give a shout if you can't hear me or if there's any technical issues. Otherwise, I'll keep trucking. So today I wanted to share a little bit about my work with regards to longitudinal injury surveillance at the Paralympic Games and some of our historic work in this area, as well as next steps that we're looking forward to into the future. And as was noted in the introduction, I'm currently an assistant professor of physical medicine and rehab and sports medicine at Harvard, and deeply involved with the Olympic and Paralympic movement, currently chairing the IPC Medical Committee. So thank you for the introduction and opportunity to present. So a brief agenda for the morning or afternoon, dependent on where you're living. So I'll first talk a little bit about just the importance of Paralympic injury and illness surveillance, a little bit about what we've done in systematic data collection, as well as our initial findings, and talk a little bit about unique patterns of injury in Olympians versus Paralympians and how this research has informed our knowledge on that. We'll talk a little bit about a sub-analysis that we're doing in para-athletics or track and field, just to sort of give you a little bit of an insight and a high-level overview of how this can then inform sport-specific injury prevention, and then a little bit about what comes next. So I wanted to just first frame this topic and talk a little bit about the Paralympic Games and give you some information regarding the most recent Paralympics, which were in Rio 2016. Of course, we're currently, I'm sure now, all catching the coverage of the Winter Olympic Games that are taking place in Pyeongchang, and the Paralympic Games will be taking place next month, beginning on March 9th in Pyeongchang. So Rio is the most recent past, although we're almost now to our next games, in a few short weeks, which is very exciting. If we look back to Rio 2016, I wanted to share some of these numbers just to show you that this is a very large sporting event. The Paralympic Games are now the second largest sporting event in the world after only the Olympics. So in Rio, we had over 4,000 athletes competing from 159 countries, plus 2 IPA or independent Paralympic athletes who were refugees. At the Games, we had 220 new world records, and there were a total of 22 sports on the program, including 2 new sports, which were canoe and triathlon. So very exciting. The reach of the Paralympic movement continues to grow. For example, there were 5 countries in Rio who had their first ever Paralympic gold, and they're listed here. These are all countries where the whole programming around Paralympic sport is really sort of an up and coming topic, and it's very exciting to see more regions and countries from around the world becoming involved in this movement. And if we think about the reach of the Games, it's clear to see there are a lot of athletes competing, but very important to know that particularly when we think about both TV and web-based platforms, that a lot of people are tuning in to watch the Games. In Rio, there were a little over 2 million live spectators, but over 1 billion spectators on digital media. So this is a large sporting movement that is growing very rapidly. Also wanted to provide this as an example just to give you some insight with regards to the competitiveness of the Paralympic Games. You know, the Paralympics have really evolved from initially being seen as a tool for rehabilitation for people with disabilities to now being seen as an elite sport, which they are. One example of that was the 1500 meters, in which the gold medalist, Mr. Baca from Algeria, finished in 3 minutes 48 seconds, which was actually faster than the gold medal winning time in the 1500 meters at the Olympics. This is an athlete with a moderate degree of visual impairment. So athletes are athletes, so these are elite athletes, and you know, certainly our research and clinical programming around this area has to take that into account. Also wanted to provide a little bit of, you know, just another point of reference. You know, I think when we talk about injury surveillance and injury prevention, it's important to remember that athletes are athletes and they're all going to push themselves to the limit. And wanted to show you one brief picture of track and field. So this is a crash that occurred in the sport of wheelchair racing at the Paralympics in 2008 in Beijing. And just wanted to say that, you know, athletes are going to push the envelope, and injury is in some ways somewhat inherent to sport, because when you push yourself to the limits of, you know, of performance, injuries do occur. And I have a personal experience with that because I am right here, helmet number 2, involved in this, I would say, sort of freeway pileup of racers in Beijing, and thankfully no one experienced severe injury in this event. But you know, just want to say that it, to some extent it's inevitable, and we have to be prepared for that when we think about sports science and sport medicine. So a lot of the work that we're doing in terms of injury and illness surveillance and prevention follows this model that was initially developed by Wilhelm van Mechelen, and was initially published in 1992, and really has become sort of the staple or central paradigm for how we think about injury surveillance and injury prevention research. The first step here is that we have to first quantify the problem. You know, what is the incidence of injury? What is the severity of injury that we're seeing in any given sport or sporting event? The next step then is we think about, well, what's the etiology of that injury or the mechanism? So why is the injury occurring? The next step then is to try to introduce a preventative measure. And then in step 4, you go back and assess its effectiveness to see whether or not you've changed the incidence and severity of injury based on your prevention. So with regards to our work in Paralympic sport, we're really here. We're in step 1 and step 2. A lot of the work I'm going to talk about is really in step 1. And now we've just started to get involved in terms of step 2 and are thinking about starting the planning stages for step 3. So, you know, when we look at the scope of research on Paralympic sport within this realm, we are still in the early stages, but we're very excited about the progress that's being made. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how this study takes place. So when we think about monitoring injuries and illnesses at the Paralympic Games, you know, there are many ways in which you could do this, right? If you compare to our colleagues in Olympic sport, at the Olympic Games, there's been a data collection system in place for many years, and that's largely based on a paper-based system where physicians from either the teams that are there or from the organizing committee fill in each form for each injury they see, and that gets logged at the end of the games. On the Paralympic side, we actually did something that was, I guess you could say, a little bit disruptive in a good way, beginning in London 2012, and that is that we developed a web-based platform through which team physicians or team senior medical staff could log in and enter data as they went through the games. So on each day of the games, or with each athlete encounter, they could actually log on and capture that in real time, rather than having to fill out a paper-based form that would then need to be filed electronically later. So I shared this image. This is an example of the interface that was used at the London 2012 Paralympic Games. And this is what you would see if you were a team physician that would log in order to enter the data for your athletes. And this initial picture that you see here was the screen that was used to capture what we call denominator data, which is you know, the total number of athletes that were on any given team on any given day of the games. And that denominator data is really important so that then you can define incidence, which is, you know, the number of injuries that you see per athlete or per athlete day. So I bring this up just to say that we have developed a web-based system, which is very exciting, and we'll continue using this into the future. And in this way, we're actually kind of on the cutting edge of injury surveillance in sport. So when we look at information, I'm going to share a few of our initial findings. So when we looked at the London Paralympic Games, this was the first time in which we rolled out this system at a Summer Games. The Summer Paralympics are about 10 times the size of the Winter Paralympics. So this is a large number of athletes. And data collection can be logistically quite a challenge, but the web-based system was extremely helpful and quite successful. So some of our key findings were that we noticed that compliance was quite good with using the online platform and the web-based injury surveillance system. We found that if you look across all athletes, that males and females had similar rates of injury. We noticed that in female athletes, the pre-competition phase, that is the few days in which the athletes are in the village but not yet competing, that phase actually showed a very high injury rate in comparison to in competition. And that's quite interesting. It's clearly indicating that athletes are probably nursing injuries that then get reported when they come to the games and or experiencing out of competition injury, which of course is very important to know about. We found that injury rates were lowest in younger athletes. That's probably somewhat intuitive, particularly as it relates to overuse injuries. We found that the highest rates of injuries were actually in the upper extremity, first and foremost the shoulder, followed by the wrist, hand, and elbow. This is different than in Olympic sport, where the lower extremity shows the highest rates of injury. And when we looked at sport-specific data, we noticed the highest rates of injuries were in these sports, that is football five-a-side, which is football for visually impaired athletes, powerlifting, goalball, wheelchair fencing, rugby, and athletics, athletics being the international term for what we in the US call track and field. This is just a figure showing a comparison of injuries in Olympic versus Paralympic sport. And here, if you compare the Summer Olympics versus Summer Paralympics, as well as Winter Paralympics to Winter Olympics, you see that the injury proportion and injury rate is higher in both Summer and Winter Paralympic sport compared to Olympic sport. If we look at comparing the London 2012 Paralympics to the Beijing Summer Games that had occurred one quad prior to that, we noticed that the proportion of athletes injured is higher in Paralympic sport. That is, when we look at upper versus lower limb incidents, we notice that the upper limb is injured more commonly in Paralympic sport compared to Olympic sport, with a ratio of about 1.5 to 1 in Paralympic sport compared to 0.3 to 1 in Olympic sport. So here we see that the body area impacted by injury is different in our Paralympians, which is a very unique and important finding. So that was a very brief overview. If you want more information on some of these studies, these were the original papers that came out initially in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. I think this presentation is being recorded. So, these are available on PubMed or any of your common literature searches, and obviously a great deal more data available in these papers if you want to dig a little deeper or use it as background information for your own research. Please take a look. So then wanted to fast forward. If we fast forward 4 years, so what I initially presented was the information from London. Then, of course, 4 years later came the Rio 2016 Games. And at that time, we were able to make several improvements to the system based on our experience in London 2012. A few of them are noted here. So this was the interface and the platform used in Rio. And some of the things that we added were, first and foremost, what you see here is listed as step 4, and that is, what is the athlete's primary impairment? So in London, we were a little bit of a disadvantage because unfortunately the system didn't capture the disability type of the athlete. So we weren't able to draw a lot of conclusions based upon that factor. Whereas in Rio, we captured that right from the start, which was very helpful in beginning to formulate hypothesis around how one's disability type might impact their incidence of injury. So when we look at data from Rio, we recorded a total of 500 injuries, and the incidence rate was about 10 injuries per 1,000 athlete days. And about 12% of all athletes at the Games encountered an injury. Interestingly, if you plot that in comparison to London, you'll see that the injury incidence rate actually went down from London to Rio, and that's kind of a curious finding. We're not quite sure why that might be the case, with exception of the fact that that, potentially just because of the study being ongoing, people becoming used to the concept of injury and illness prevention in Paralympic sport, could potentially at the athlete level or at the country level, more prevention was being implemented. Another theory is that in Rio, we actually had quite a lot of difficulty in collecting information from the venue medical stations and the athlete village clinic, just because of logistical challenges, language barriers, and so on. And so what we may be seeing here is that the injury incidence rate is lower because a lot of the athletes who would typically report to the venue medical stations weren't captured here. And those are typically athletes from smaller countries, more countries that don't have their own team medical staff. And so that's also why this trend was possibly observed. When we look at specific sports, those sports noted here in red had the highest incidence of injury, but also were found to be in and of themselves risk factors for injury. So this is, of course, coded on the bottom here on the x-axis, but if I could decipher it for a little bit for you, WB is wheelchair basketball, JU is judo, F7 is football 7-a-side, which is football for athletes with cerebral palsy, F5 is football 5-a-side, which is football for athletes with visual impairment, WR is wheelchair rugby, and WF is wheelchair fencing. So as noted, those sports in red were actually independent risk factors for injury after adjustment for age and sex. So clearly we're seeing a trend in which these sports are somewhat more dangerous in terms of injury risk. Additionally, I wanted to focus a little bit on the sport of football 5. Here you see it had the highest incidence of injury. And we do have some concern about this sport, and this is going to be an area of increasing focus into the future because it's a sport in which there's a very high risk of athlete-to-athlete collisions, reporting in head contact. Here you see a picture of the sport in which athletes are playing football or in US terms, soccer. But these are athletes with visual impairment. And so in order to even the playing field, the rules of the sport mandate that the athlete wear an eye cover, as is pictured here. And so obviously these athletes are playing the sport aggressively. The ball contains a bell or a sound mechanism. So when the athletes are going for the ball or chasing the ball, they're relying on sound. But they might not see another athlete coming, and they don't have that sort of reflexive protective mechanism because they are blindfolded. So because of that, you see a lot of athlete collisions, and we're very concerned, particularly with regards to the risk of concussion in this sport. But injury prevention models are very underdeveloped and have not yet really been addressed. So we do have concern, and this is going to be an increasing area of focus into the future. I wanted to see if this would play. If not, I'll just skip it here. But let me try. So this is just this is a video of one of the matches in Rio.
Changes are allowed.
And what you'll see is this is a game between Brazil and Turkey, and you see the athletes all blindfolded. This is a star from Brazil, and you see here as the athlete, this athlete goes for the ball right here, bam. Okay, so here you saw head-to-head contact between the athletes. The athlete on the field of play appears, down and clearly injured and potentially having experienced a concussion. But unfortunately, the sport yet at this point doesn't have a concussion protocol in play, and that's something that we now recognize through both video analysis as well as through our injury data, and something that we're working closely with the federation to change these practices and policies, and a great example of how research can inform policy development. Okay. So now I'm going to use this one more example just to show you a little bit about how we're getting into step 3, or moving from step 2 to step 3, which is establishing the mechanism of injury and to then thinking about prevention. So I wanted to provide the example of shoulder or upper extremity injury in the sport of para-athletics or track and field. So when we looked at data from London in terms of overall injury incidence, we noted that athletics or track and field was a sport that had quite a lot of injuries. Here you see table 2 from the initial London paper, and you notice that athletics had the 6th highest incidence of injury of all sports on the program. It's also the largest sport in the program in terms of total athletes competing. Additionally, you'll remember from one of my first slides that we saw a predominance of upper extremity injury in the overall London data. So given these two findings, we wanted to look more closely at the sport of para-athletics, or track and field, so that we could understand a little bit about which subsets of athletes were experiencing upper extremity injury and therefore potentially informing prevention. So when you think about the sport of athletics, or track and field, it's the largest sport on the summer program. It's a very high profile sport. I think many of you have seen some pictures or video from these fast-paced wheelchair races or amputee sprinting, for example. So this is a sport that's definitely in the public eye. It's a sport that's unique because it's an individual sport and with multiple different disciplines, everything from the 100 meters through the 10,000 meters to high jump to long jump to throwing field implements. It's a very diverse sport. And because of that, you have athletes with very different impairment types that are all represented in competition. The events that are contested are listed here. Track is everything from the 100 meter up through the marathon, and field involves the jumping disciplines, high jump, long jump, as well as the field disciplines, javelin, discus, and shot put. So when we think about, I want to take a brief pause to talk a little bit about classification. So classification is a process that's unique to Paralympic sport, in which we put athletes into categories that enable them to compete on an even playing field with athletes that have a similar level of disability. So, so it's really a system that's designed to even the playing field for athletes that have quite different types of disability. And in doing so, we ensure that the most talented and well-trained athlete wins, rather than simply the athlete who has less of a disability. So for example, if you had an athlete with a cervical level spinal cord injury who had both arm and leg weakness, it would not be fair to put them on the track and have them race 100 meters against an athlete with a lumbar spinal cord injury who only had lower extremity weakness. So the classification system exists to ensure that in competition, athletes are competing in a fair manner with athletes who have a similar level of disability. When we think about Paralympic classification, these are the different impairment types that are eligible. And these are described based upon function rather than on diagnosis in a very purposeful way, so that athletes with different types of diagnoses could actually potentially fall within the same impairment type. So for example, an athlete with impaired muscle power might be an athlete with spinal cord injury, or they may be an athlete with, for example, multiple sclerosis who has weakness because of a spinal cord lesion, but not a traumatic spinal cord injury. An athlete with ataxia or athetosis is probably an athlete with cerebral palsy. An athlete with limb deficiency may be a below-knee amputee, but that below-knee amputee wouldn't be classified against someone with an upper extremity amputation, but rather be put in a category with other below-knee levels of injury. So this is a system that's quite intricate, and I don't want to get too in the weeds, but just to say that this exists, and it's part of our considerations when we think about how we consider injuries in a sport like track and field, in which you have multiple different disability types competing in the same sport. A little bit more information regarding athletics, or track and field. I wanted to provide the example of track events, that is running events, and the different impairment types or classifications. So this is a number and letters based system, which is all Greek unless you have an introduction to it or understand it a little bit more. So I'm going to explain briefly. So in track, the categories T11 through T13 are specifically for athletes who are ambulatory, that is, they're running but they're visually impaired, like these athletes here from the US. This is David Brown and his guide runner. Athletes in the category T11 in particular are typically completely blind or near completely blind and run with a guide runner. Athletes in the T30s, that is T35 through T38, are usually runners who have cerebral palsy, like this athlete, who may have some increased tone in the lower extremities or some motor weakness because of their disability. Athletes in the class T42 through T44 are typically runners who have lower extremity amputation, such as this very well-known athlete from Great Britain named Johnny Peacock. And athletes in categories T51 through T54 are usually wheelchair racers, such as this athlete. This is Chantal Petitclerc from Canada, a very well-known female wheelchair racer. So if you see here, this is a very heterogeneous sport. You have a lot of athletes with different disability types competing in one sport, but in different events. Drilling down just a tiny bit more, when we think about athletes who are visually impaired and we compare, for example, a class T11 with a class T13, what you see is that even within the visual impaired categories, we further subdivide. So for example, an athlete in class T11 is usually completely blind and has to run with a guide at all times, and is typically blindfolded to totally obscure their vision. This evens the playing field in case an athlete would have just a small amount of residual vision in comparison to someone who's totally blind. Athletes in class T13, on the contrary, typically have some vision. They're usually legally blind, but not completely blind. And these athletes typically run without a guide and have impairment in their performance because of the disability, but a much lower level of functional impairment compared to athletes in class T11. So I think it's easy to see that when you think about a sport like this becomes quite a conundrum in terms of how do you do a sub-analysis when you have athletes of all these different disability types competing in one sport, and how do you compare apples to oranges? So I wanted to share this with you. This is how we divided up the sub-analysis, and this was a very novel approach to try to think about how you can classify injuries in a way that makes sense when you have all these athletes with different types of disabilities. If you looked on the string on the left, you see track events, and we divided track events into those that were ambulant, in which the athletes are running, versus wheelchair racing, and then under the ambulant categories, we further subdivided them into amputees, those with cerebral palsy, and those with visual impairment. If you then look on the right side of the screen, you see field events, and these were further subdivided into ambulant throws, in which athletes are throwing from a standing position, ambulant jumps, in which athletes were jumping from a standing position, and seated throws, in which athletes were typically wheelchair users who are then throwing field implements from a specifically designed chair, in which they're strapped onto the chair and then throw the implement. So by implementing this type of subdivision, we were able to get a little bit more information and sort of make sense of the analysis as it relates to injury patterns. Okay, and now I want to share with you some of the key findings from this sport-specific analysis. So overall, we had a total of 977 athletes from 138 countries competing in athletics. We had a total of 216 injuries that were reported, and our proportion was 18.4% of athletes, which made for an incidence rate of 22.1 injuries per athlete days. There was no overall difference in injury rate comparing track versus field, and the majority of injuries were not time loss, meaning that they were more mild injuries that didn't require missing time from training or competition. Additionally, age group was not associated with injury rate. And when we compare athletics, or again, remember athletics is track and field. So when we compare athletics, an Olympic versus Paralympic sport, you'll see that overall on the Paralympic side, our incidence proportion was a bit higher than on the Olympic side. The way that the denominator was described is a little bit different in these two studies. We described it as per 1,000 athletes, whereas on the Olympic side, Alonso and colleagues defined this as per 1,000 registered athletes. But here you can see if you would take our number per 100 athletes and simply multiply it by 10, you get approximately 180 injuries per 1,000 athletes. So at the end of the day, it's pretty clear that we see more injuries in this sport and Paralympic sport compared to Olympic sport. Additionally, what we saw on the Paralympic side is that injury location was very impairment and event specific. So for example, our ambulant athletes experienced the highest incidence of injury to the thigh and knee, whereas our wheelchair or seated athletes experienced the highest incidence of injury to the shoulder and clavicle region and the elbow. So our ambulant athletes had more lower extremity involvement, and our wheelchair athletes had more upper extremity involvement. Somewhat intuitive, but the first time that this is objectively shown in the research. Additionally, we noted that ambulant athletes with cerebral palsy had fewer injuries when compared to those with visual impairment or amputees, with an injury incidence rate of only 10.2 compared to 23 and 29. We think this is probably because that there may be a protective effect of the athlete's tone or spasticity. Because of the tone, the athlete probably does not have a full forceful contraction of the hamstrings or the quads, when they're when they're at their highest speed of running. And this is the time that's often the highest risk of injury in able-bodied athletes. You've probably seen prior video of 100 meters in which you'll see a sprinter suddenly go down in the middle of the race with an acute hamstring injury. We think that that probably does not happen as frequently in these athletes because of the tone. The tone is due to their disability, but it actually may be protective in terms of injury prevention. Additionally, what we saw was that those who were engaging in field events from a seated position, that is seated throwers, actually had more injuries, excuse me, this should say more injuries rather than fewer injuries. Seated throwers had more injuries when compared to wheelchair racers, with an injury incidence rate of 23.7, which was quite high. And when we think about that, our hypothesis is that it's probably because of the explosive nature of that throw mechanism, which when you're not up and engaging your legs and core to generate force, you put your upper extremity at higher risk. So for example, if you look at someone like Tatiana McFadden, who's a very well-known wheelchair racer, yes, she's engaging in this repetitive sport with her upper extremity and with use of her shoulder, but it's actually in quite a neutral position, sort of a low risk position as compared to our field throwers. And if you compare a shot put thrower who's able-bodied on the left compared to a shot put thrower who's seated on the right, you see that the able-bodied thrower is able to generate a lot of force through their lower extremities and core, whereas that seated thrower is prevented from doing so because they're seated and seatbelted onto the chair. And we think this places the shoulder at particularly high risk of injury. So this does have implications for injury prevention. For example, for our seated throws athletes, these athletes certainly need a strong emphasis on shoulder injury prevention with, for example, a shoulder stabilization program and optimizing the strength and recruitment of their core. And from the standpoint of our ambulant track athletes, we should remember that lower extremity tone may actually be protective. And if we treat their tone with, for example, treating their spasticity with oral medication, we may actually increase their injury risk. And when we think about prevention programs, we should particularly focus on visually impaired and amputee athletes who are at higher risk. And for all, of course, education is really critical so that we translate these findings to our athlete population so that they also understand their own injury risk profile. So what comes next? Almost done here, but just want to share a few final thoughts. So I think it's clear to see that the work that we've been able to do at the Paralympic Games is really just a snapshot. The Paralympic Games take place once every 2 years. So, it's certainly, I think, compelling data and interesting information. But when we think about injury prevention, the more important thing is what happens year round as these athletes are in their training, when they're at their peak of physiologic stress, which typically comes prior to competition. So we're doing a lot of work with trying to recruit national Paralympic committees as well as international sport federations to do longitudinal work that's similar to this but goes year round so that we have a more comprehensive look at injury patterns rather than just this snapshot during the games. One example of good work in this area is coming out of Sweden, where Christina Fagher and her mentor Jan Lexell are doing work. They've actually built an app in which all of their Paralympic athletes report symptoms year-round via the app. Those symptoms are then investigated by a clinician and tracked and reported. So they are doing year-round injury surveillance, which is incredibly important, and very much look forward to seeing their findings. Additionally, another important step into the future is partnering with sports federations, particularly those where we know there's a more urgent need, like football five-a-side, where we're very concerned about head injury and concussion. I think that there's some interesting questions here. For example, we know within the mainstream population or the able-bodied population that head protection, like helmets, have not been found to be protective against concussion. And it would be interesting to know whether or not that's also the case in visually impaired athletes where they don't have that same reflex protective mechanism. Additionally, the sport has something called the voy rule, which is a rule in which as athletes are chasing the ball, they're supposed to be yelling out voy, 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 which means I go. The sport was initially developed in Spain, so this is a Spanish word for I go. And we found that over the years, this implementation of this rule has been very lax, and we think that that may also be leading to more head-to-head contact. And so also working with the federation to ensure that this type of policy and rule is actually implemented as it should be for injury prevention purposes. So, what comes next? Well, I think that there's certainly increased opportunities for education and awareness. We've been doing more and more with regards to sessions at ACSM, including, for example, I'm based in Boston, so my regional organization is New England ACSM. Also trying to do more work with AMSSM so that we're, directly contacting clinicians for those who are interested in learning more about this work. We're trying to get more Paralympic focused content in team positioning courses so that as clinicians are going through their training programs, they have exposure to these unique aspects of Paralympic sport. There is an ACSM certified inclusive fitness trainer certification. I bring that up just to say that, we understand that not every athlete's an elite athlete, and the fitness at the community level is also incredibly important, and ensuring that those opportunities are inclusive is incredibly important. And increasing collaboration between what we're doing on the Paralympic side with our colleagues at the IOC. And we've been fortunate to be able to present some of this work at the IOC World Conference on Injury and Illness Prevention, as well as Advanced Team Physician course. And we hope to be able to continue and do more of this into the future. And the most important thing is that ultimately we want to get to a place where Paralympic sports medicine isn't considered an afterthought, but rather an integral component of training and the core of sports medicine and sports science. So in summary, there's been a really exponential growth of the Paralympic movement in Paralympic sport. We're really in the early stages of understanding injury and illness patterns in these athletes, and it's clear that these patterns may vary in para-athletes compared to able-bodied athletes. Surveillance is important in providing a first step towards understanding these patterns, and we certainly need more work on longitudinal studies, implementation of prevention programs, and definitely on educating and raising awareness amongst providers. I just want to say the future is bright. This is a mentee of mine. I'm, of course, the old lady on the right, and on the left is a young athlete named Maddie, who has spina bifida, and she's very, very into wheelchair racing. She actually already does 5Ks. And here she is holding my Boston Marathon trophy. And the future is bright with athletes like Maddie who are coming up through the ranks. And I hope that when she someday competes, which I'm pretty sure she will, that we understand more about injury prevention and how to implement, the right measures to protect athlete health. So thank you very much. I would be remiss to finish the presentation without showing a picture of our baby, who's now 10 months old, actually, Stella. Thank you for this opportunity from ACSM, from my colleagues here in Boston at Spalding and the Brigham, our Harvard Department of PM&R, and many mentors, friends, and colleagues who have enabled me to engage in this work. And if anyone has any specific questions, here's my email contact information and also social media information. So I'll stop there. I have references as well in case anyone's interested.
Great. Thank you, Cheri. That was really informative and very interesting. I know we'll all watch the Paralympics with a different approach, a different lens. So we really appreciate your time. We're going to have a few questions. I'm going to ask folks here in the National Center to come over to this computer so that we can do your questions on the mic on this computer. So while anybody's coming this way, we did have one question that came in remotely. One of the viewers who joined us from afar was wondering, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that the Paralympic gold medalist in the 1500 meters, I think it was faster than the Olympic winner in that same event. And so the question was, well, should that person be competing in the Paralympics or the Olympics? What would be the challenges with someone with that level of visual disability trying to compete in the Olympics as opposed to the Paralympics?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So we know that there's, so as it relates to individuals who are legally blind or who have a more mild level of visual impairment, a lot of when we think about sport performance, most of the impairment probably comes from, or the functional impairment in sport probably comes from issues related to things like neuromuscular control and also course navigation. I think that the question is really the answer to that question probably needs to go to a kind of a different level related to things like sports governance and policy. And, we've seen these lines blurred over the last 5 to 10 years in which we have Paralympic athletes who have the skill to compete an able-bodied sport as well in their same discipline. And we've even had some athletes who compete in both the Olympics and Paralympics having rightfully qualified for both. For example, there's an amputee swimmer from South Africa, Natalie Detroit, who's competed in several Olympic Games and Paralympic Games. And you've also seen some examples of amputee runners, for example, competing in both. And most of the, I mean, from my perspective, I think if you qualify, you qualify. And I think if someone has met the standard to compete in both the Olympic and Paralympic Games, that they should have that right. There sometimes is issues related to regulation, particularly on the Olympic side. So for example, I think this would not be the case for the visually impaired runner, but for our amputees, there's some case history for the use of a prosthesis being banned from able-bodied competition, for example, which then prohibits that athlete from being able to compete on the Olympic side. And then that typically needs to go through an appeals process and through the courts and that sort of thing. So I think we're seeing a new era in which we'll have more and more athletes who fit that bill of being able to compete or qualify for both. And it's going to be probably case by case in terms of what we see as the legal precedent for whether or not that's possible for different types of disability. But I think it's a great question. And I think as it relates to the mild visual impairment, that the functional implication for sport becomes less and less as the physiology for running is still intact. So.
Great, thank you. We have a question now from one of our ACSM staff.
Yes, this is David Brewer. In the football 5 segment that you were talking about, the enforcement of the VOI rule, this might be a naive question, but has there been any research or development done in some kind of signaling systems similar to what they're doing with the ball? You said the ball gives off a signal or a bell, where the players would emit some kind of an electronic signal to where people that would let everybody know where everybody is. If anything's been researched like that?
Yeah. I don't think there's any research on that. I think it could be a consideration. The environment of the sport is very unique. It's actually kind of exciting if you're ever able to see a game live. And what they do is that before play is started, they actually ask the whole crowd and all the audience to be quiet, because the stadium needs to be quite quiet while the game is being played so that the players can hear the ball. I think that's an interesting idea. I think one, counter argument would be probably player acceptance of it, because I think that they typically are so focused on the ball, which sometimes is somewhat difficult to hear, or the audio, if you're, for example, on the other side of the field, it's quite some distance away. And so if all the other players around them also have some type of auditory signal, then they may have a harder time hearing the ball. But to answer your question at a very objective level, no, there's no work into that yet. And the sport actually is just now sort of developing the capacity to form their own medical committee. That's been something that's really only happening over the last 2 months. But it's very exciting to see, because that will then enable medical professionals, both MDs, but also sports scientists, sports psychologists, and so on, to be around a table and think about how to evolve the policies of the sport to make it maintain its high performance aspect, but still be safe.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Great question.
Hi, this is Gretchen Patch, also at the National Center. I have 2 questions, if I can be greedy. My first one is, you kind of dug into the data around the football, the 5-sided football, but I was intrigued by the injury rate with fencing. I don't really, do you have just maybe some broad strokes detail of what that looks like, or what those injuries might entail with fencing?
Yeah, it's a great question. We were intrigued by that one too. And we haven't yet done that sub-analysis. Typically, the way it works in real time is after each games, we process the overall data in terms of both injury. Today I focused on injury, but we also do the same thing with regards to illness, things like respiratory illness, skin, GI, GU, all of that. So we typically do the overall cohort for injury and illness, and then whatever patterns we see bubbling up, that we think are the most clinically relevant, then we do sub-analysis to try to learn a little bit more about why that might be the case. We haven't done fencing yet, and it's been on the table because it is somewhat intriguing. Mm-hmm. There may be somewhat of an impact there with regards to just athlete numbers. It's a smaller sport than some of the others, so it may be just that because the overall N is or the overall denominator is quite small, that we're seeing. It just happened to be that a few athletes experienced injury, but then if there are a few of only a few, the injury rate looks quite high, or the incidence rate looks quite high. So, so we don't know yet, but we'll probably take a look at that in a sub-analysis into the future.
So I think you might have, with that answer, maybe answered my next question, which was if there's been any analysis done of injury by country. And my thinking there is if there are countries that have less developed medical staff or fewer resources, you mentioned that some countries send fewer medical staff with their teams. If those athletes experience higher rates, and if there can be some recommendations to the organizing committees to, there needs to be a minimum level of medical support provided per team or something like that.
Yeah, good question. So the way the overall study works is that we enable, so all countries, and when you think about how the IPC works, it's really a member organization to a great extent. And all of the countries are members, and the sport federations are also members. So any member of the IPC can actually apply to receive their own data for the purposes of their own analysis. And some countries have done that. If they want to know, just for example, not that they plan to process it and publish it, but they just want to know for purposes of running their team well, or knowing what type of coverage they need for international events. And so we don't do for example, we don't process the data of just one country because, we want to be careful not to be too selective or, have the appearance of playing favorites with certain geographical regions or anything of the sort. But the data is available to the countries themselves. One thing that we've done that was interesting was look at overall illness. There's been some research in the able-bodied population that shows that the longer you travel, i.e. the more time zones you jump to go to an international event, the more likely you are to experience illness, likely due to transient impact on the immune system with flights and with just issues related to resetting your own internal clock and all of this. And similarly, in the Paralympic population, those athletes who traveled a further distance to London in terms of time zones showed a higher illness rate. So that's a finding now that's proven across both Olympic and Paralympic sport, which is kind of interesting. But we have not done, say, for example, per continent or Southern Hemisphere, Northern Hemisphere, or by GDP or anything like that yet to this point, but it would be interesting. There are some studies that show that there was a more of a sociological study that looked at medal performance in correlation with things like GDP and overall markers of socioeconomic status, showing that, and not surprisingly, but showing objectively that countries with higher GDP, had a higher, I guess you could say, medal count per capita than countries with lower GDP. And that was published in PLOS One, actually, and it just, the conclusion was obviously that, we have to do better in walking the talk with regards to being an equitable movement.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
All right, I think we're going to be respectful of Cheri's time and just take one more question. So I think Caitlin has a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Caitlin Kinzer, also at the National Center. I know that what you talked about today has mostly to do with the injury rates that occurred during the games, but I was curious if you guys have looked into training facilities at all and have had any thoughts about, accessibility of training facilities, number of training facilities in different places worldwide, and do the number of training facilities that are available to people in their countries reduce the risk of injury or increase the number of athletes in general that are competing from that area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we haven't done that. I think that'd be really interesting. You know, one of our sort of, I guess you could say, visions for the future is thinking about the formation of a series of research centers. So if you look at the Olympic side, the IOC actually has, I think it's now 10 injury and illness prevention centers that are academic centers around the world that are able to, you know, carry that brand of the IOC and that support of the IOC to do more site-specific work, and just obviously helps to increase the overall volume of work in this area that's done. And that's something that I think that we need to do at the IPC. It obviously, you know, it always comes back to resources and where would the funding come from and all of that. But even if it were to be not a lot of funding, you know, even just a small amount of support, and then putting the Paralympic name behind it, I think that would be my personal opinion. Something I'm pushing for is that would be worthwhile doing, because until we do something like that, we're a little bit limited to kind of thinking about like, well, what's our research jurisdiction in a way? Because a lot of the countries and sport federations get a little bit antsy if you start to kind of dig in and look at what they're doing and objectively try to analyze it without them being on board, rightfully so. So, you know, thinking into the future, what needs to happen is that the IPC collaborates with the federations directly and forms an MOU and says, hey, we're going to help to provide capacity for you to look at what's happening in your sport or in your country, you know, in forming collaborations with national Paralympic committees. So these are all, I think, steps for the future, because I think your question's a great one, but we haven't had the capacity to do that quite yet. As it relates to the one small finding that I think is interesting that somewhat correlates to your question is that when you look at, I think I mentioned in the talk that the pre-competition injury rate in London was higher, and particularly in female athletes. And my hypothesis for that is that I think female athletes, particularly in settings where there aren't as much resources, probably don't have a lot of ability or sports medicine services to have that injury diagnosed and cared for locally. And so then when they arrive at the games, there's suddenly this huge cadre of sport medicine providers, and they, you know, immediately go and report the injury and then get assistance with the treatment plan and diagnostics and all of that. And so I think that's why we're seeing a high pre-competition injury rate. It's not that people are coming into the village and falling and injuring themselves, but rather they're nursing injuries that aren't reported until they get there.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Cheri. Let's everyone give Cheri a big round of thank you. All right. Well, we really appreciate your time today, and we are going to end the webinar with that. Thanks again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.